Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the U.S. policy towards Iran and the U.S. position on Syria. To talk about this, we are joined by Peter Rowe, fellow at the Hudson Institute, and Guy Taylor, national security team leader at the Washington Times. Thank you so much both for joining us today. I want to start by asking on the latest comment by President Trump in the press conference that was held in the White House with the Prime Minister of Italy. Basically, the president was saying, we are willing, and he is willing, to meet with Iranians, with any Iranian officials, because he believes in talking. What does this comment mean to you, especially that it felt it was delivered or deliberate?
Yeah, I mean, I think the timing of it ahead of the reimposition of sanctions with the American pullout of the nuclear deal, the timing right ahead of that reimposition was clear. And I think Trump fashions himself as the master negotiator. So at this stage, a year and a half into his presidency, it's not very surprising that first we have a lot of drama with the deal pullout and the threat of new sanctions, and now suddenly he comes forward and says, actually, you know, I'm open to talking with President Rouhani. That fits with the pattern, and I think it's a genuine offer. Does it actually play out and happen? There's a lot of sort of like rhetorical brinksmanship between now and then as to how will the Iranians respond. We're still waiting to find out. But I read it as it wasn't exactly off the cuff. I think it was sort of meditated, and I think that it fits with Trump in this idea that what he wants to do. And originally, on the campaign trail 2 years ago, he said, it's a horrible deal, it's the worst deal ever, I'm going to trash it when I get into office. It took him a while, now he's done it. He's pulled out, he's trashed the deal. But as he ramped up towards trashing the deal, he started to say, well, what we want is a renegotiated deal that's better. So it's not somehow shocking, because this is now the first step towards, well, maybe we've let the Iranians sort of lick their wounds over this whole thing a little bit, and now we can start the process of possibly a renegotiated deal. That's what I saw it as.
Peter?
Well, in a way, if you want to contextualize it, I think it fits into this coercive diplomacy strategy that the president seems to be pursuing. On the one hand, there is the ratcheting up of economic pressures. The Iranian currency has been in free fall. There are protests seeping out of Iran on social media all throughout the country. And so the pressure is definitely ratcheting up on the Iranian leadership. And on the other end, he's saying, but there's a vision of a different future if you wish to take it. And so if Iran's prepared to meet some of the conditions that Secretary Pompeo has laid out, if it wishes to rejoin the international community, then there is a better future for Iran, partners with the United States. But based on the policies it's pursued thus far, it's hard to see where the Iranians can, A, accept this sort of an offer and actually move into a positive direction, because they've been destabilizing America's traditional partners in the region. It's been pursuing a campaign of terrorism for years. And so there are huge differences between the United States and Iran. This is part of the president maybe even sort of turning the playbook back on the Iranians, saying, we're prepared to talk. Are you? Are you the obstreperous ones? So it's vintage Donald Trump. It's kind of a spontaneous almost statement, but it fits into the broader context of his strategy of coercive diplomacy.
I mean, do you think that this also might mean any change in the policy by the administration? Or is it, like what Peter just said, that, you know, I'm putting the ball in your...
I don't think it represents a stated change, but the Trump administration will open itself to criticism, both from its base and especially from the left, if it suddenly moves the goalpost and says, well, you know, we're willing to have negotiations after we've laid out this long list of mandates that the Iranians must meet, such as pulling their proxy army out of, stopping their support for the Houthis in Yemen, pulling their Hezbollah out of Syria, all of this long laundry list, in announcing the pullout from the 2015 JCPOA, the list was, this is what you have to do if you want to reach a new deal. But it was not, this is what you have to do to have a discussion. So I think if you now have a discussion, there's going to be a lot of criticism to the administration that says, look, you said you have to have this mandate, now you're having this discussion. The question is, the Iranians look at what happened with the Singapore summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, and they say, well, you know, there was huge rhetorical brinkmanship leading up to that, but then Trump met with Kim Jong-un, and suddenly now we're not really sure where the negotiations are going. This could be that the ball is in the Iranian court, and it's an opportunity for the Rouhani government to step forward and say, well, we could actually meet with this guy, and maybe we could come out on top again. Do the Iranians have an appetite for that after the Olympics that went into negotiating the 2015 JCPOA? I doubt it. In fact, I think they're tired of dealing with, if you look at all of the rhetoric in the last 3 months that has come out of Tehran, I think they're tired of dealing with the Americans. They've already said, you know, what was the point of reaching this deal if the Americans, they can't be trusted.
Well,
so
they
why
took
would
a
we
lot
sit
of
down with
money
Donald
and
Trump
they
right
had
now?
all this, you know, their way, basically, in the Middle East.
Sure, I mean, that's a good
They gained a lot of
counter-argument. I'm not going to
things.
deny that, but I think that the rhetoric and the position from the government in Tehran has been, what was
Escalation.
the point? What was the point of working with the Americans? They can't be trusted. So they have some ground to cover to now come forward and say, all right, we'll try again with this new president who's hurled threats at us. And so, I mean, that's just the dynamic. I'm not going to dispute anything that either of you are saying. I don't disagree. I'm just trying to
I do
Yeah,
think
and
it
I'm
out.
trying to, exactly, understand.
If I could add to that,
Please.
I do think that maybe one difference between President Trump and his predecessor, President Obama, is that he's prepared to kickstart a negotiation through a meeting, but not kickstart the negotiation by first making concessions. And for President Trump, talking is not really much of a concession. To draw parallels to the way he's managing the North Korea question, there was the meeting in Singapore, but aside from a declaration, the United States was not prepared to, for example, alleviate economic sanctions on the North Koreans, which is really the central lever through which we're pressuring the North Koreans. And I think in the case of Iran, he'd be prepared to meet with the Iranians. By the way, I don't think that's going to happen, but if he did meet with the Iranians, it wouldn't mean that this pattern of sanctions that is about to take place starting next Monday and then again in November pertaining to oil sanctions is not going to be, for some reason or another, either pushed backwards or curtailed altogether just because there's a meeting on the horizon. That won't happen. American policy is on the trajectory it's on, and this was just, I think, one statement after a press conference. Some people on the left will criticize and say that meeting in and of itself is giving up leverage to the Iranians, or in the case of Korea, to return to that example, to the North Koreans. But I think the Trump administration, or at least this president, ignores that criticism and doesn't think it's valid.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the Iranians, though, what will they gain out of meeting the president? And even if it's just to show off national inside of Iran to their people and say, hey, look, we got an invitation from the American president, would that be an incentive for the Iranian regime to go ahead and actually pursue such a meeting? Or what would they gain or lose from this?
I mean,
and I want you both to answer. Yes.
Look, aside from trying to analyze the politics inside Iran about whether or not they'll have to save face or it will look bad if there is a meeting. What they could gain is a new paradigm for negotiations that's very much oriented around top-down negotiations. Everything about the JCPOA was basically bottom-up negotiations. There were high-level players, mid-high-level players at the foreign secretary level, but really the negotiations played out among teams for years. And we never got to the point where President Obama was meeting with President Rouhani. This is like flipping it 180 degrees and saying, let's reach a new deal, and it's going to be top down. So you know, Trump will want to have a private meeting with Rouhani. He may want to even try to meet with the supreme leader. Who knows? With President Trump, this is his almost his dogma. Is this idea that he's this master negotiator that can meet with anyone. That's potentially an opportunity for the Iranians to approach this through a new paradigm. Maybe they can gain some sort of inside concession with the administration. I still don't think that they're going to take the meeting, though. I think that they'll look at it and they'll say, why would we do this? We already reached a deal with the Americans. The Europeans don't like that the Americans pulled out, and now we're going to pander to the whims of an American president who, in all likelihood, will be gone in 2 years. Why would we sit down and play along in this sort of kabuki theater of meeting with him?
What do you think?
Even if the Iranians wanted to meet with President Trump, in the end, I don't think President Trump would meet with them for the following reason. If we return to the example of North Korea, that summit took place after a very clear signal from the North Koreans, from the highest levels of that government, that they wish to meet with the Americans. And following that speech that Kim Jong-un gave, there was also a pause in some of the most provocative escalatory dynamics in North Korea. There were no missile tests, for example. So there was a bit of momentum that led to that summit. Not very much, but some momentum. In the case of Iran, there's virtually no opportunity for momentum because from the Iranian announcement that they're going to conduct more aggressive tests in the Straits of Hormuz, all the way to their active support for President Assad's attempt to reconquer massive parts of his country by force, it's hard for me to imagine, in addition to the ratcheting of tensions and the economic problems, it's hard for me to imagine that we would have this period of pause that would allow for that sort of a meeting to go forward. Secondly, it's hard to imagine the highest levels of the Iranian leadership reaching out to President Trump in that sort of manner. And thirdly, the North Korean regime has its country relatively isolated, so it can control the messaging that seeps through to the North Koreans. That's not the case in Iran. The Iranians are incredibly connected to the rest of the world, and so they'd be playing with fire by opening up a process and a dynamic that they then cannot control. There have been leaders in the past, most notably, of course, President Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, who attempted an opening of sorts, and that didn't really work all that well for its own leadership. So I think they'd be very careful and hesitant to undertake this sort of a meeting. And a lot of the other rhetoric that bracketed the statement by President Trump, from Qasem Soleimani's warnings after the president's tweet a few weeks ago, really don't suggest a lot of momentum towards a peace summit of any sort. So it was a big moment in the East Room, but in the end, I don't think we should make all too much of it.
Mm-hmm. What about Iran or the regime itself today, knowing the economical situation, the fall of their currency, now obviously the unrest inside of Iran, the escalation of the protests? I mean, what are the prospects for this regime, given the sanctions, the economical disaster going on inside, and obviously the overstretching of militias that is doesn't seem doing too well?
Sure.
In many parts.
From this side of the world, from Washington, the story that the Trump administration and the U.S. State Department are trying to tell, and it certainly looks this way also from the media here, that this is a really tenuous moment across Iran, and that the dynamics of the demonstrations that have happened are also complex. This is not just coming from some sort of anti-regime elements. This is actually some conservatives who are also angry and playing deep politics in Tehran. There are all kinds of elements to it. So yes, it's a tenuous moment, and the falling currency adds to that. The pressure on the Rouhani government, pressure to do something is clearly there. But is the answer to that to somehow reach out to the Americans or reach back? I think that's a bridge too far. In terms of the Trump administration and its stated policy, however, I mean, we've gotten a lot of rhetoric about confronting Iranian proxies, containing Iranian meddling in the Middle East, but we don't have a really clearly or explicitly stated policy from this administration about actually having a war-like situation, a kinetic response to Iranian proxies. So far, it's been a lot of talk and then tacit support, which is of Saudi Arabia, to basically lead a campaign against Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen. And it's also been tacit support for the Israeli Air Force to carry out air raids against Iranian or Hezbollah convoys inside of Syria. The United States is not actually taking some kind of action that is going to change the dynamic. Right now, it's a lot of rhetoric, and what we're going to, the first real action will be the reimposition of sanctions, which has been a huge amount of hype, but we're going to have to see. It's almost as if, and again, this is an analysis from Washington, but it's almost as if it appears like Tehran is in almost a state of disbelief that the sanctions are actually going to go back into place in the coming days. So we're going to see how the government responds in Tehran. We'll have to listen for the rhetoric and see what they come out with.
I think for a lot of, in particular, American conservatives, who might matter most right now, given that the Republicans run the government, the most important strategic factor in the Middle East over the past several years is the rise of Iran. And the Trump administration is focused on this laser-like. It also, however, has sort of an America First wing to it, which means that on the one hand, it wishes to roll back Iran. On the other hand, it doesn't wish to involve itself in the bloody wars of the Middle East. And so it's picked its favorite tool, its favorite lever, and that is economic sanctions. Iran is a revisionist, so it will find support from other revisionists like Russia, like China, for example. But the traditional order, the allies, the United States and its global alliance system, and the economic power it can bring to bear is massive. And I think the Iranians will find out that trying to revise an order that's led by the United States has major costs to it, to your domestic economy, to your ability to export oil and gas, which is its major commodity, among other items. And so I think the Iranian leadership may be making gains on the grounds elsewhere in the Middle East, but at home it's rather brittle for a lot of reasons. And the U.S. will only accelerate this in the coming months to go for many of the reasons that you stated.
I think just to add to that, look, there is the stated policy and rhetorical brinkmanship about the nuclear deal. And then there's the deep geopolitics, which is more of this sort of John Bolton national security level geopolitics. And there, what you see the administration trying to do is drive a wedge between Moscow and Tehran. And to sort of say, to pander to Vladimir Putin and say, look, you have succeeded in upholding the Assad regime. You've done it with your ally Iran. This is your war at this point. It's your problem. It's your space. But we could get more deeply involved, or we could get along if you could maybe distance yourself a little bit and set some ground lines, red lines on the ground inside of Syria that push Hezbollah back. This is also the Trump administration doing Israel's bidding to a certain degree. You'll see just in the last day or two the movement of Russian peacekeeping forces into the Golan Heights, almost like as a buffer between Iranian proxies in that area and Israeli forces. This is a major geopolitical development in this war zone. And I think it's important to realize that happened after President Trump met with Vladimir Putin. One of the biggest things that came out of that was, did they talk privately about coordinating somehow to tamper the influence of Iranian proxies inside Syria. And if the Trump administration is willing to quiet down and not make comments about the Assad regime and sort of accept that the regime is here to stay, the process of a political transition is over, the Russians have won that, then perhaps they can push on the Russians to say, we're going to contain Iranian influence inside Syria. I mean, that's part of what's playing out.
What would you say to that, Peter? Because we also know that we don't know what happened in the meeting, but we know that Russia wanted the United States to withdraw from Syria. They want to only withdraw Iranian forces 100 kilometers, which was not accepted by Israel. Yesterday we heard that there was 85 kilometers that the Russians are saying that they've already have withdrawn the Iranian militias, but we don't know what the Israeli response to that.
I think the Israelis are worried that Iran possesses capabilities, irrespective if they're 80 or 150 kilometers away from the Golan Heights, that can threaten Israeli citizens. And so that's why Netanyahu's made the case that Iran needs to withdraw altogether from Syria. Basically, I think to return to Helsinki, the Trump administration's or the president's view of the Russian-Iranian alliance in the region is that on the operational level, it's very tightly connected and interwoven. The Iranians and the Russians sit together in command and control and think through operations and order them on the ground, no doubt. But on the strategic level, I think the president is hopeful that one can drive a wedge, just like President Obama was hopeful, between the Russians and the Iranians. Because, for example, the Russians don't want a northern bridge from Tehran to the Mediterranean, where the Iranians might eventually be able to export their own carbohydrates to Europe. It's a major market for the Russians. It'd be a new competitor. I'm skeptical of this, however. I don't think that it's possible to drive the Russians from the Iranians. I think a lot of American analysts, you seem to make a similar point just a minute ago, are doubtful or dubious that this will be possible, in part because they need one another, in part because I think the Russians only have so much sway over the Iranians. At a certain level, they might hate one another, but they also need one another. And so I think of this as the Russians trying to position themselves as the swing player. They're the key player for the Israelis, and that all of these discussions are taking place in Moscow. Netanyahu was in Moscow just before Helsinki. He continues to go to Moscow to have conversations with President Putin. So the Russians really are the key player for the Israelis to try to build out a buffer zone to push the Iranians away. And for the Iranians, the Russians are kind of the key interlocutor, try to work through and manage some of these security issues in the region, even though they too kind of resent deeply, I think, the Russians. So In a way, we see here kind of interesting power dynamics playing out. Overarching it all is that the Russians moved in 2015. They're on the ground, and in the end, diplomacy is only as powerful as your forces are, as the muscle that you can actually bring to bear. And as long as the United States is unwilling to do that, it's not going to be able to shape the political outcome.
The United States accepted Russia as the main player in Syria, but not Iran. And that alone is basically putting Russia in a position where it has to actually just turn a blind eye on its so-called ally while it's getting bombed by Israel.
What's hard to say, I'd say they are in the process potentially of accepting. I don't know if they've accepted yet. I do think, presumably, although I'm obviously not privy to these discussions, that Prime Minister Netanyahu has made the argument to President Trump to try to move into alignment on how to manage this issue. But in the end, if you are President Trump and your view of the Middle East is that it's a morass in which Americans have spent over a decade spending a lot of money and a lot of American blood, then you're trying to develop a new security architecture built around your traditional allies. And if that doesn't work, you need a bridging mechanism. And here Russia potentially is a solution. Again, I don't think it's necessarily possible, but I do think still converging with your traditional allies is the way to go. And there, I think at least the president is much closer to my own thinking than perhaps his predecessor was.
What about Israel in this? Because you were going to say that Israel would probably accept 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers. I mean, what do you think of that Russian proposal to Israel?
I mean, it appears now as if the Netanyahu government is willing to accept massive Russian influence and sustained presence inside Syria, and not only accept it, but vie for that on the condition that it means contained Iranian proxy presence or Hezbollah permanent bases. So that's the negotiation that's going on between Israel and Russia, and the United States is sort of following it, because I don't think that there's a consensus or an establishment in Washington that believes that Russia has American interests in the Middle East in mind or wants to protect them in any way. But if the great American interest is Israel and the alliance between the U.S. and Israel, and Russia is willing to work towards protecting that or bending to it, that appears to be the direction we're going in. That's what we're seeing.
I just don't, if I'm sitting in Jerusalem, I don't know what choice I necessarily have. You're a relatively small power. The Russians are not de facto, they are on the ground and playing the key role in northern Syria, even southern Syria now. So from the Israeli point of view, they would much rather have the United States be the one that has large-scale forces on the ground, creates an air perimeter, builds up opposition forces, and squeezes Assad. That would have been the Israeli preference, but it simply didn't happen. And so now they're dealing with, reluctantly, realities on the ground. I think the trade that they're willing to make, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has more or less said this, is to accept the restoration of the Assad regime in return for the Iranians getting pushed out. That is a huge concession by the Israelis to the Russians. I mean, that's recognizing their principal proxy on the ground in Syria. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, over the 40 years of Assad control in Syria, we haven't had a bullet cross the Golan Heights. So they're prepared to make that concession, but in return, they want the Iranians pushed out. And I don't think 80 kilometers or 100 kilometers or 120 kilometers is going to be enough, because strategic weaponry can still reach Israel. So they want a full expulsion of Iran out of Syria in return for, on their part, a tacit acknowledgement that Assad is in control of Syria.
What about, there's another very tricky issue that people have been talking about since that meeting between President Trump and Putin, which is a Russian proposal and a Russian interest in returning refugees from Lebanon and Jordan in exchange to having American and European money basically flooding to those areas that were devastated and destroyed by the war, but they will actually be going to Russia and the Assad regime to, quote unquote, rebuild those areas, while we know on the ground there's a lot of fears by human rights organizations and people who are monitoring the situation that, first of all, the Assad regime would be killing those refugees. Second of all, they will be taking that money into funding their own militias and their own wars, and obviously the corruption and all of that. So
this is, again, Russia holds the cards at this point.
But do you think the administration will accept such an attempt, because the United States refused before basically putting a penny in Syria as long as Assad is in power?
I honestly don't know yet. I think that on the surface, it appears politically, from an American domestic political standpoint, that absolutely not, that the administration will push back hard against that. But when you really get down to what this administration is doing in its attempt to work with the Putin government and its acceptance of Russia as the major outside influencer in Syria at this point, this is Russia's war, and this is Russia's responsibility to lobby the powers that be around the world with the money and say, if we want to move forward, you've got to kick in some cash for it. It's very interesting to see this happening right now. How is Washington going to respond? How are the Europeans going to respond? Look, there's a lot of pressure on Washington from the neighboring countries, specifically Jordan, to try to do something to get Syrians out of Jordan and Turkey, the same pressure from Turkey, and back into Syria. So this is delicate, it's difficult. How that plays out, it's important to recognize that, though, that the refugee crisis in Jordan is a big deal. This is not something the Jordanians want. They want to move on to the next phase. They want people to go back. The Turks, the same thing. So is the answer to have to play ball with an Assad regime that's still in power? How far we've come from a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, where we were actually seriously trying to negotiate a political removal of Assad. Here we are now, 180 degrees, and this is difficult. This is going to be a difficult debate in Washington.
What do you think, Peter?
Well, I think it's one thing to acknowledge reality that Assad won't be removed. If we go back to the heady days of 2014 and 15, when it looked like he was about to fall before the Russian intervention, I think our political expectations were vastly different than they are today. But it's an entirely different thing to empower Assad. So I don't think recognizing that he has recreated an Alawite heartland, even if we don't officially recognize that, which I don't think we should, and that he's re-ensconced himself in that spine of Syria that runs from Hama, Homs, Damascus, now all the way down to Dara. That's one thing. But I think to actually send Western money into Syria, I think would be a huge mistake to support the Assad regime. The first statements I've seen out of European capitals are that they're not prepared to do this, that they're still emphasizing the Geneva process under Stefan de Mistura, which I think is the correct way to go. And as much as we're always worried about the Europeans going soft, I don't think that in this case they're prepared to go even that far. And the Russians will be the ones going around the world, as they already are to the West, expecting aid in part of the political backdoor rehabilitation of President Assad. But I don't think the Americans are going to fall for that. I don't think the Europeans are. And if they did, I think it would be a huge mistake.
And President Trump doesn't like to pay.
That's the other thing. We're cutting back our reconstruction aid to the Iraqis, for example. It'd be hard-pressed for me to think of a similar amount of money then flowing into Syria, to, in particular, in areas under control of President Assad.
The tricky political nuance to this, from an American domestic political standpoint, is that President Trump has had a relatively anti-refugee policy, putting a halt on refugees coming into the United States. It fits within his wider immigration posture. So for him to try and politically round the circle and say, well, what we need to be doing is repatriating Syrians who are living in temporary refugee-type housing in camps in Turkey and Jordan, this is how he could try to do that. I don't disagree. I actually think I'd be very surprised, though, if he suddenly says we're ponying up a bunch of cash and we're going to pressure the Europeans to help the Russians repatriate Syrians who fled so that they can live in Assad Syria. I'll be very surprised if that happens.
That said, and I think you raised this earlier, it's very important not to overlook what a burden our traditional allies in the region are playing, from the Jordanians to the Turks, in housing millions of refugees. This has been, and the Lebanese, this has been a huge lift for them. And I'm very worried about the future of Jordan, as I am about Turkey and really all of our partners in the region. So I do think we need viable solutions. I just don't think it should go through Damascus and Assad.
A big question always comes up when we talk about Syria today is Idlib, because now, since we are seeing the end of the situation in Daraa, things are calming down. basically Assad took over back a lot of the parts there. But what about Idlib? Because all of these people who are fleeing the Assad regime and their militias and the Iranian militias taking over their houses and homes and areas are going to Idlib. And now we have over 2 million people there in a very tight space. But we are hearing now some talking about Russia actually starting to bomb that area, even though there was some sort of deal between Turkey and Russia to not attack this area.
The Russians are ensconced in an incredibly messy situation in Syria. How they're going to do some sort of a better job than the Americans or anyone else is outside the bounds of my imagination. So the idea, everything we're talking about up to this point, of returning millions of Syrians to towns and cities inside Syria, and the idea that this is going to happen while there's an Assad government that wants to absolutely crush any whisper of dissent is probably fantasy. So what we're talking about is a bit of a black hole here of the way forward, unless there's a continued dynamic and discussion of opposition and the Geneva process. This is where the Europeans are on this, of not giving up on the idea that there's some sort of political solution that has to be met that reduces the Assad regime. Yes, it was heady times 2 years ago when it looked as if the regime would fall and there would be a political transition and possibly even elections of some kind. But the idea that we just abandon that and now rush towards moving refugees back, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Russians are getting ahead of themselves, and it's going to be difficult for them.
What do you think about Idlib?
Well, there were, I think, 4 deconfliction zones in Syria. We know what happened to the other 3. The Russians basically ignored their agreements, provided the air power for Iranian regime troops, I should say, on the ground to reconquer those areas. And so if those reports of bombing are true, it wouldn't surprise anyone. Past in a lot of ways here as prologue. I think, as I said earlier, just as the Russians wish to be the swing player between the Iranians and the Israelis in the south, I think they also wish to be the swing players between the Turks and the Syrian Kurds in the north. And Idlib is sort of the big wedge that they can drive towards the Turks, who, as I also mentioned, are really straining under the weight of millions of refugees. And now, with millions more in Idlib, they could bomb those north, create refugee columns that would really create huge problems for Turkey and for NATO and the West. They can threaten to embrace the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are really a cover for YPG, the Syrian Kurds. That, in turn, of course, worries the Turks, who wish to break up the canton that the Syrian Kurds are building or attempting to build in the north. If the Americans and when the Americans withdraw, we'll see what takes place there. So the Russians are basically saying to the Turks, if the Americans don't help you reinforce this red line that you've set in Idlib, we could create massive problems for you. We could create refugee columns and streams. We could break up your operations in the north, and we could align with the SDF, which is a ready-made proxy on your border that you view as an existential threat to you. And conversely, it's whispering to the SDF, which was just, and the YPG, which was just in Damascus for talks, that you are now an empowered militia. As soon as the Americans leave, you'll be exposed to the Turks. Come over to our side, and together we can work out a deal. So they're really kind of swinging between these two poles in the north. And Turkey, I think, is in a precarious position. So we'll see what happens. The South, as you mentioned, is beginning to calm down, although that's a very antiseptic way of putting it, more like it was brutally conquered. And now the North is sort of open and available for the next move in the Assadian attempt to reconquer the rest of Syria.
Do you think Turkey has enough leverage on Moscow, and there's enough interest for Russia to not upset Turkey after all of Turkey is basically leaning towards Russia, and basically go ahead and actually try to bomb Idlib?
Yeah, I think Turkey is a bit of a wild card now because of its own domestic political situation. A lot of what went on with the bare-knuckle posturing and kinetic military activity by the Turkish military against the YPG elements and incursions right into northern Syria, a lot of that went on in the lead up to President Erdogan's attempt to solidify his hold over the presidency. And so we've now had that happen. There's been an election in Turkey. Erdogan is here to stay. His powers are are solidified, and it's almost as if that was being used to ramp up, first of all, anti-American sentiment inside Turkey, to sort of work with the Russians, but also to ramp up the anti-Kurdish sentiment among Turkish nationalists. So this is like a key piece of trying to read how aggressive the Turks might be and how willing they might be to just accept Russia as the major power broker inside Syria. I honestly don't know whether the Turkish military intends to play hardball with Assad. If we jump back to the beginning of Erdogan's leadership in Syria, you'll remember that prior to the Arab Spring, he was not averse to the idea of partnering with the Assad regime in Syria. So Erdogan has a lot of power at the moment, and reading the tea leaves of how he's going to respond to this situation, I think is difficult, and I think it's changed since the election, which just happened on June
24th.
Mid-June, yeah.
Yeah. What would you like to add, Peter, if anything?
Well, I think from the American point of view, the joint operations between the Turks and the United States in Manbij are a positive sign. I also think the attempt to try to not dilute our position in the north, but recalibrate from a pure SDF, Syrian Kurdish solution to ISIS, towards kind of a broader geopolitical picture where we embrace some of Turkish sensibilities, as well as ensuring that we don't abandon proxies that we've used now for several years to try to defeat ISIS. So I think that's a sensible way forward, to take on Turkish concerns near Manbij, take on the Turkish view of things in the north, at the same time ensuring that we continue on against Islamic State and don't abandon our proxies. But then the real question is, will we support the Turks further in the northwest, near Idlib, and kind of in that northern corridor? Because from an American view, I think the end state of a Turkish buffer zone that's somewhat pacified, which takes on board, again, also some of the concerns of our SDF partners, is ideal, but it requires an American presence on the ground, and that's, I think, really the million-dollar question that we have to ask ourselves.
I also, just to add to why I think it's unpredictable with the Erdogan government right now, look, one of the first foreign visits that Mike Pompeo, current Secretary of State, made prior to being Secretary of State when he was appointed to head the CIA was a secret visit to Turkey, which came out afterwards. And part of that was to try and lock down an eye-to-eye agreement with the Erdogan government about how, despite all the other disagreements, whether it be over the Kurds or Turkish flirting with buying Russian weaponry, there was one thing that Washington and Ankara could see eye to eye on, which was that the Islamic State needed to go. The Daesh was out of control. It was a threat to Turkey. It's a threat to Europe. It's a threat to the entire region. It's a threat, and that the Turks and the Americans needed to see that and work towards it. Now that we've had a 30-minute conversation here about this conflict zone, and we haven't even talked about Islamic State or Daesh because it has effectively been pushed down far enough that it's no longer the center piece of discussion.
But I will talk about it when we move to the SDF.
Just to finish my point,
yes.
Now that that's out of the way, look at the U.S.-Turkey dialogue. It's not focused on the deep geopolitics about northern Syria. It's focused on back towards now Pastor Andrew Brunson. The really somewhat surprising move, even though I reported that it was going to happen like 12 weeks ago, look, the surprising move of leveling sanctions, U.S. sanctions on individuals around Erdogan because of the Andrew Brunson case. This discussion going on between Turkey and the United States is not really about the Kurds in Syria anymore. So I think it's unpredictable, and it's a little bit volatile, and it's not clear where it's going to go or where Erdogan is going to side on this.
And it is unpredictable because we also saw that President Trump was really nice to Erdogan during the NATO summit. And there was some, publications talking about this. And then now we saw, obviously, the whole issue with this. I mean, I want to hear you, Peter, too, about this. Why did we see this fluctuation again in the American-Turkish relationship?
Well, just the most immediate proximate cause, the sanctions on the two Turkish ministers around President Erdogan due to the continued detainment of Pastor Andrew Brunson, I think is because the president reportedly felt double-crossed by Erdogan. He thought he had an agreement with the Turkish leader about the release of Pastor Brunson. One also hears this from senior government officials here in the United States. And so, as his spokeswoman, Sarah Sanders, pointed out, this really was an order from on high. The president himself, President Trump that is, wanted some sort of action, retaliatory action against the Turks. And quite frankly, it's an outrage that this man is still being held in Turkey. So I don't blame the president for being upset about it. That being said, the broader geopolitics, I think we also have to be sympathetic to the Turks. The United States really is the only country in the region that takes ISIS as its top priority. Everyone else is fighting for different ends. The Saudis are worried about the Iranians are worried about the Saudis, the Israelis are worried about the Iranians, the Assad regime wants to defeat the opposition, and the Turks are worried about the Kurds. And here the United States is, several years ago, casting about for a way to defeat ISIS, unprepared to do it ourselves. And so we find the first willing and able proxy, which is essentially the kissing cousin of PKK, YPG. PKK is a terrorist organization listed by the United States and Turkey that is responsible for many, many deaths in Turkey, tens of thousands of deaths over the past 30 or 40 years. So I can imagine that if in the United States, another partner was working on the Mexican border with an organization that was responsible for many American civilian deaths, our leadership wouldn't take that very kindly either. So I don't think we're totally innocent in this. I think that any Turkish leader, irrespective the challenges in democracy in Turkey at the present moment, would take a similar line. They would be equally frustrated, and as a result, they've taken a lot of action in their own hands. And I think that is what happens when the United States pulls back from a region. That is when the United States doesn't take up its role as a coordinating partner, ensuring that the Saudis, the Israelis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Turkish, all of their interests are understood, are collated, and then a coherent strategy is put forward. Instead, we basically left the Turks out to hang, and so now we have the result that we have. And I think it's incumbent upon us not to abandon those who we work with now for the past several years, but also to work with Turkish interests as well as the Kurdish interests to try to find a viable solution in the face of what might be an Assad, Russian, Iranian onslaught in Idlib.
What about the SDF? And the big question now, like you said, there were meetings between the SDF leaders and the Assad regime, fears from people who talk to me directly on the ground, the Arabs who are in the Raqqa area, who are very afraid of Assad and his militias coming back to those areas because they think they will be killed. So is that something that we might see the United States actually withdraw its forces and allowing Assad to come back, or be there and allow the Assad militias and the Iranian militias, therefore, come back to these areas while there's an ongoing policy anti-Iran in place?
Look, the current U.S. military footprint inside Syria is relatively light already. The air supremacy over the region, which is run out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, is it's connected day to day, moment to moment to that light footprint, but that's not going anywhere. And the idea that this light footprint is about to go away would contradict what President Trump himself has said on repeated occasion over the last several months, which is that the Americans will be there for a while or for the long term. He hasn't said we're going to ramp up troops inside Syria.
Yeah,
that this footprint
he
is
said
not,
long term?
He's said it on multiple occasions. Yeah, we've not heard a discussion about there's going to be a ramp up of troops. But if you go back to, I want to say April speech,
when he said
the Americans are not going anitiwhere. They're not leaving. I mean,
but there's a lot of back and forth on this.
Sure, there's a lot of back and forth, but he also took sharp criticism from critics who said, "Oh, you're engaging in an open-ended military deployment in Syria without a new authorization for military force. The only reason to be there was because there was a connection between ISIS and Al Qaeda, and the original use of military force authorization somehow fit within that. With ISIS gone, you can't do this." And he did not respond to that by saying we're going to pull these troops out. He said we're going to be there for a while. So I haven't heard a change in rhetoric on that. Maybe you have. But.
Well, I don't want to cast contradictions and euphemisms, but I just think he's unconventional in a lot of ways. When the president went to Ohio and said that we're going to get out of Syria, I interpreted that more as kind of an order to his advisors to find a sustainable solution. I think he hears so many of the cliched, banal, kind of old, tiresome policy solutions from the Washington establishment that he just doesn't think work, and he doesn't want the United States to continue. So he's pressing them, find out ways to get the allies to step by, find out new interesting security constellations that might be able to shoulder some of the burden. We're not leaving yet. Afghanistan's another great example of where he's prepared to stay, even increase the number of U.S. troops because it's in the American security interest. But he doesn't want to be there another 10 years, and he doesn't want to be in Syria in massive force, I think, for another decade or two. But he's prepared, I think, to stay in Syria as kind of new arrangements are worked out, as the situation stabilizes. And I think that returns us to the discussion we opened with, which is how is he trying to work out relations with the SDF, with the Russians, and with the other traditional partners in the region, which is why, in the end, we need the Turks. I think to both confront the Turks and the Iranians on the ground in the Middle East is just an enormous muscle movement that I don't think anyone in the U.S. has appetite for. So to rally again our traditional partners, to keep the Syrian opposition alive, to build out pockets, and then to help our Saudi friends finance some of this, among other things, I think is kind of the path forward as I see it.
Would you like to add something to this about the SDF?
Look, I mean, the Americans have had repeated opportunity to speak out and really support the Kurdish militias. And what we saw with Obama, and we've seen it with Trump, is a reliance on those forces as a ground game against Islamic State militants. Other than that, the KRG across the border in Iraq held a referendum on independence, and the Americans didn't stand. They actually stood against it, basically. So the idea that somehow now we're going to see anything other than this ambiguity from Washington towards the YPD, you know, I don't see it happening. As far as the SDF, look, this fits back into this idea of some sort of cohesive militia that could be tied to a Syrian opposition. And I don't think that this administration right now really has the bandwidth to articulate a long-term policy for this. At the moment, we're sort of backed off, watching it go forward. The focus is far more on the Indo-Pacific at the moment.
I want to thank you so much both for joining us today, and I would love to have you in the future. Thanks.
Thank you.
That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for sticking with us. Good night.